Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Cultured Pull List. In this week's episode, we're going to be covering the inspiration for the new Prime Video spin off of The Boys, Gen V, which is The Boys Volume 4 We Gotta Go Now. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Mike from Casual Experts. I'll be joined by my co host, Luke, later on when we discuss this comic book, this graphic novel. But this week we are covering The Boys Volume 4 We Gotta Go Now, which is what the new spin off, the new The Boys spin off show Gen V is based off of. Now, it is incredibly loosely based. Like, you'll see when we break down the story, but everything in Gen V is different. Like, it's a really good show. The only thing they really brought from the comic is they named the school Godolkin, which is the name of a major character in this story arc. But other than that, everything's different. Like, the stories, the characters, they're all pretty much original, it seems. So, like a lot of stuff with the boys, the show takes very, very vague and little inspiration from the comic and just kind of does their own thing. But anyway, let's still get into this story. It was written by Garth Ennis with illustrations by Derek Robertson and John Higgins, colors by Tony Avina, letters by Simon Boland. This covers issues 23 through 30 of The Boys, and it was originally published in a collected trade paperback in 2009. So before we begin, just so you're aware, there is some pretty graphic and mature content in this book. I censored, anything too bad, but just so you're aware, this is definitely not a book for kids. We begin in a Vought America warehouse, and we see two guys talking, two workers talking, and they mention that they're unloading a bunch of flamethrowers, and they're very puzzled about this. So next we see Billy Butcher meeting with Susan Rayner, who is like his contact in the CIA, and she tells him that she needs him for a mission to uncover the death of one of the G-Men. Now, the G-Men are the most profitable superhero team that Vought has, even though they're independent of Vought and they operate on their own. But Silver Sinclair, this character, she killed herself in public in this small town in front of this police officer, and all she said was, "Where's Uncle Paul?" And then she used her powers to kill herself. So Rayner sends Butcher in to figure out what happened with her. So Butcher assigns Huey to go undercover in G Wiz, which is like the younger team in waiting. It's a bunch of kind of like late teens, maybe early 20s kids who are waiting to get into the G-Men. And this is very much a parody of like the X-Men and Professor X. So the G-Men are, kind of like the X-Men, but there's also like this college fraternity. That's where the G-Wiz live. So Huey's briefed by Butcher about the G-Men and like all the different G teams, and he's gonna be sent in as this guy, which is pretty goofy, pretty goofy costume. And then we also see Homelander being prank called by some random people. We don't know who they are yet, but we will. And yeah, this is Gee whiz. So Huey infiltrates them. They're having this toga party. Butcher's contact set Huey up with some papers. That he's a soup and he wants to get into the G-Men. So he's kind of inducted into G-Wiz and taken under everyone's wing pretty quickly. And meanwhile, Mother's Milk is off to the small town where Silver Sinclair killed herself. And he meets up with the deputy that was a witness to her suicide. And he tells the deputy that he's CIA, which isn't entirely untruthful. and the deputy agrees to team up with Mother's Milk to try and figure out, you know, who this person is, why she killed herself, which Mother's Milk knows she's Silver Sinclair, but the deputy doesn't. And at this point, the backstory for pretty much all the G-men, including Silver Sinclair, is that they're all adopted by John Godolkin, who found them. They were all orphans, and he basically adopted them and made him like his soup team and everything. But meanwhile, Huey is back at the frat house, and they're showing him all these debauched things that they like to do, including this home theater, which is actually devoted entirely to just watching porn. So, yeah, that's cool. And then we see Butcher meeting with the Legend, who is his contact, who got Huey his papers, his fake credentials. But the Legend tells Billy that Huey's only got a couple days pretty much before James Mallory, who is in charge of Vought, finds Huey's papers and realizes, his credentials, and realizes he's not who he is. He's not who he says he is. And then we see Mother's Milk again. He's talking to some of the townsfolk, and he's trying to find a connection to Silver in this town, and trying to figure out who this Uncle Paul person that she mentioned before she died is. Next, we see Starlight in Vought Tower, and she's walking around talking to members of the Seven. Queen Maeve just had some fun time with some boy toys. Meanwhile, the Deep and I'm not really sure who this is, but they're getting prank called. And it turns by the same people that prank called Homelander earlier, and it turns out it's the G-Wiz guys. And they try to convince Huey to join in on the prank call, but he refuses at first. And we see Frenchie and the female out in a van outside the mansion, kind of surveilling and being Huey's backup and listening to everything that's going on inside the frat house. And continuing on with the prank call, Starlight takes the phone from Ugly here, and the G-Wiz guys finally convince Huey to hop on the phone and say something, which he does, but Annie, Starlight, hears him. And at this point, I did not mention it earlier, but if you've seen the show, you kind of know, but Starlight and Huey are an item. They're dating, but neither one knows what the other does. Huey doesn't know she's a superhero, and she doesn't know that he's one of the boys, but they hear each other's voices, and that kind of makes them pause for a second because they recognize each other. Then we see the next day that Huey is being taken to G Mansion by the G-Wiz guys, and I did not mean to say it like that, but it's kind of funny that it came out like that. And they meet the G-Men and John Godolkin. And meanwhile, James Stillwell, who is the leader of Vought, he is talking with the president about some plan that they're enacting to take down the G-Men, because John Godolkin is kind of a wild card. He's doing his own thing, and he's kind of psychotic, so they want to get him out of the picture. And Huey kind of has this run-in with this Wolverine ripoff that has hammers for hands, and all he can say is "gonna," and it's just kind of funny. But the G-Wiz team gets a tour of the G Mansion, and Frenchie's listening to the whole thing, and Huey scrambles around the house on his own and plants microphones, some bugs. But then he's confronted in the bathroom by Nubia, who just kind of stands there and says, "Kill me." And then Huey screams like a little girl, and the G-Men and John Godolkin show up, and Huey says something about resurrection, which is what happened. Vought resurrected Nubia, but he kind of isn't supposed to know that, so the G-Men are kind of notice that and are a bit suspicious. Then that night, Huey stumbles upon the porn room and sees a pretty disturbing sight. I'm gonna let you imagine what's here, but it's pretty weird. And Huey realizes, he kind of sits in his room and thinks, like, what the hell is going on here? This place is pretty messed up. Next, we see this guy who is Raynor's assistant, and he's distracted and basically coaxed out of his house by this prostitute in a wheelchair, and I guess his kink is women in wheelchairs. But before anything can happen, she walks away and says that some guy hired her to keep him busy, basically, and it turns out it was Butcher, who just wanted the guy out of the house so he could steal his his hard drive, because he is suspicious of Rainer, thinks she isn't telling him everything. And the next morning, Butcher calls Huey to kind of see what the lowdown is. Huey's found out a little bit about the G-Men, the inner workings, but not a whole lot. But he expresses concern for the G-Wiz crew because they don't seem as bad as the actual G-Men and the other groups. They kind of just seem like misguided kids who have been messed up somehow. And in the next scene, we see G-Man and Godolkin having breakfast, and they're talking about Huey. I didn't mention it earlier, but his name is Bagpipes, his fake superhero name. And they mention that they're kind of like not really sure if they want him on the team or not. Next, we see Huey and Annie, Starlight, having a nice picnic at the park, and that's all they're doing, definitely. But Starlight reveals to Huey kind of about her past, her being part of the Christian superhero group, and they just kind of talk about their personal selves, I guess. Next, we see Butcher plugging that hard drive he stole from Rainer's assistant into his computer, and to his shock, he finds out that Silver Sinclair was actually an informant working for Rainer to take the G-Men down. But then she kind of snapped and killed herself, and Rainer basically got the boys to go in and take down the G-Men because now she didn't have her informant and she just wanted to take them down. But, she was lying about it, basically. She was lying about her true motives. Then we see the deputy and Mother's Milk, and they tracked down this older man who lives in the town. It turns out his brother is this Uncle Paul character, and after Mother's Milk explains what he's trying to do, trying to figure out what's going on with this young girl that killed herself, the man lets Mother's Milk in. And then we go back to Huey and Annie talking. Annie asks Huey what he feels about Soups, and he's kind of evasive and pretends to be indifferent to Soups. And next we see some other members of the different G teams showing up, G West and G Style, and the G-Men are not too happy about it because there's always a fight between G West and G Style. It's sort of supposed to be a spoof of like the East Side, West Side rappers, and they even mention like the murder of Too Cool, and supposed to be a spoof of Tupac. Kind of funny, I guess. Then we cut back to Mother's Milk. He's talking to this older guy. He tells Mother's Milk about his daughter Grace, who went off with his brother Uncle Paul because they were close. And while Uncle Paul was supposed to be watching her, he turns away for a second while they're out in public, and when he turns around, Grace is gone, and Paul ended up killing himself over the incident. But then this guy shows Mother's Milk a picture of his daughter, and she has silver hair, and it's pretty apparent that she's actually Silver Sinclair. And it seems like, she's definitely not an orphan, which was previously thought about all of the G-Men members. So next we see Huey out with the G-Wiz guys during St. Patrick's Day. They're enjoying themselves, engaging in severe bacchanalia, and Huey manages to slip away from them and meets Butcher at a nearby bar and tells Butcher what he knows, which isn't a whole lot, but he knows something's off. There seems to be something more sinister going on with the G-Men and all the G teams than meets the eye. And Butcher tells Huey that he's out, he's done being undercover, and to come back home and to just kind of disappear and not talk to the G-Wiz guys anymore. And yeah, here's the expected fight between G West and G Style. The next day, we see that Stillwell has finally found Huey's file. Except it's Bagpipe's file, and he finally got his hands on it, but he recognizes Huey and starts to take action. And we see Huey is actually at Silver Sinclair's memorial service, going against Butcher's wishes. And Frenchie and the female spot him there, though, and they tell Butcher, who immediately freaks out. And then we see the president speaking on the phone with Stillwell, and Stillwell tells them that they need to move up their timetable and enact their plan as soon as possible. Then we see the legend on the phone with Mother's Milk, who is trying to get into the VOT American database to look up more details on the G-Men and their origins. And the legend gives Mother's Milk a temporary password that'll get him past security for a few minutes. After the memorial, Huey is taken to this field, this forest. I guess it's a forest, not a field, by the G-Wiz guys, and they reveal that they know he's a spy. Godolkin told them after Stillwell told him. And they try to kill him, but he tries to reason with them and convince them to leave, the G-Men, the G-Wiz, and they don't have to go down this road, they don't have to go down this path, but they aren't convinced. And before they can kill Huey, the female and Frenchie show up, and female does her thing and slaughters almost all of the G-Wiz guys. But I don't remember this guy's name, but this G-Man, he ends up getting a telepathic distress signal from one of the G-Wiz guys as soon as he gets killed. And so now the G-Men are alerted. And Mother's Milk interrogates one of the only the only surviving G-Wiz guys. And he tells them that he knows that they're not all orphans. He looked up all the orphanages that they're supposedly from, and they don't exist. And there just seems to be like a cover-up trail over the history of all these kids. So this kid, scared out of his mind, reveals that Godolkin just kind of goes around and finds these low-income and kids living in bad neighborhoods and basically just adopts them. Well, kidnaps them and promises them all this stuff, all this money, and pretty much everything they can want, and that's kind of what causes them to stay as well. And he reveals that the G-Men's purpose is basically to silence, aka kill, anybody who becomes disenfranchised with the whole operation and tries to spill the beans or tell anybody about it. And so that's what happened to Nubia. Silver killed her, but then Silver had second thoughts after a while. And he also reveals that Godolkin molests all the kids that he kidnaps, and he just kind of manipulates everybody and turns it into like this giant gross thing where like some of the kids he's molested help him molest the others. It's really fucked up. But right after he tells his story, the G-Wiz kid gets killed by one of the G-Men who kills him and teleports out. And as the boys turn towards G-Mansion, which is actually where the forest was, right outside G-Mansion, they see all the G-Men assembled outside. Huey, so mad at just everything that Godolkin has done to the G-Men and everything, just kind of angrily stomps over to confront them, and the boys follow him because they don't want him to go alone. But before any fighting can ensue, Stillwell shows up with a military kill squad and just slaughters all of the G-Men. And as soon as all of them are killed, Stillwell steps out of his helicopter, confronts Butcher, and basically tells him we can clean up our own messes, and tells him to screw off, basically. And then there's an epilogue showing Stillwell cleaning up the remnants of Godolkin and the G-Men, including this little kid squad he had, which, yeah, you can imagine what happened to them. Nothing good. And we see Mother's Milk parting ways with the deputy as Mother's Milk is about to tell Silver's father what actually happened to her. And we then see Stillwell plotting with Homelander to take down Butcher. But they can't really do a frontal assault because of all the dirt he has on them. But they're trying to find a more covert way to take him down. And we see Huey and Annie cuddling in bed, but Huey kind of has a breakdown emotionally and tells Annie that his girlfriend was killed. Then we see Butcher and Raynor, who have been having an affair this whole time, but he threatens her over her lying to him about Silver and says, like, if you ever put me or my guys in harm's way again or consult with any soups without my knowledge, without my okay, then he's gonna kill her and her whole family. And that's where the story ends. All right, everyone. So before we go any further in this episode, I just wanted to talk about this cool giveaway that we're doing for the month of October. It's a hardcover deluxe edition of The Sandman Book 1 by Neil Gaiman, we are doing some horror stuff this spooky season in October, and one of the most famous horror DC series is The Sandman, and it's really good. So, if you want to win this, to enter, all you got to do is subscribe to this channel, like this episode, and answer this week's question. And the question of the week is, who is your favorite character from The Boys and why? And this character can be from, the comic or the show or both. Yeah, just subscribe to the channel, like this episode, and let us know in the comments who your favorite Boys character is, and you will be entered to win the giveaway. So, The Boys Volume 4, we gotta go now. What did you think of this?
I really enjoyed it. I think that with the comics specifically, it's overall it's a lot harder. I think it's a lot less accessible overall because
Yeah.
compared to the show is satirizing the sort of modern superhero.
Mm
I don't want to say genre because it's not really a genre, but the modern superhero idea, I guess. Um, Whereas the comic books is satirizing comic the sort of dark, gritty comics from the 2010 era, and so like the
hmm.
audience
Mm
is so much smaller, and so it's a lot harder for people to I mean, a lot of people, harder for people to understand that. But once you kind of understand that, like, okay, so kind of put yourself in the mind space of like Civil
hmm. Mm
War, sort of that kind of era, the New 52 era of comics, then
hmm.
like
Mm
I think that like, okay, that's what they're making fun of. I think yeah, I think that it really makes it really amplifies the boys comic book because
hmm.
it
Yeah.
is it's really clever. I've read some of the issues kind of all over, and there's
Mm hmm.
I think it's like in the issue like 41 or something.
Yeah.
Vought is going to like reboot the seven, and they're
Mm
like
hmm.
giving them dark costumes and like dark backstories, and it's like, well, that's obviously making fun of the New 52. And so once
Sure.
you know that information, I think it really makes the comic a lot easier
Yeah.
to understand.
I'd like to be explain that because, yeah, the boys comic is more parodying like the comics, whereas I feel
Right.
like the show is more parodying or more satire for like the movies plus just pop culture,
Yeah.
like superheroes and pop culture in general.
Right. Back to now that we have that information out of the way, we can talk about this comic
Yeah,
specifically.
right.
Um, I really liked it. I thought that one of the things I really liked before we even get into the story is I really liked
Hmm.
the covers of the issues,
Yeah.
specifically because there was one where um, it was parodying a famous X-Men cover. I think it was X-Men 100, where
Okay.
I don't remember I think it might have been issue 26 or 27. I don't remember.
Hmm.
But obviously the cover of the volume, the
Right.
collected edition, is a parody of that movie Animal House. And I thought
Right.
what even more was even more funny was because one of the characters in the G Wiz, I think is what it's called,
Yeah. Gee whiz. Yeah.
was was a direct was inspired by John Belushi, which I thought was really
Was
funny.
that the one that could vomit?
Yeah, Blowtorch, I
Y-
think is what his name was.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, oh, that's really funny. Like,
Yeah, that is
they're
funny.
paying
And
like a
they
really
had like they had a toga party too at like the when
yes,
Huey
yes,
first showed up. Yeah.
right, exactly. So it's more than just like a cover. Like this whole story is kind of influenced by that, which I think is really
Yeah.
interesting.
It
And I think I really like also that towards the end of the story,
mhm.
the G Wiz guys are like kind of I don't really know how to describe it, but they're just sort of like depressed about like, yeah, once we leave G Wiz, like everything's
Yeah.
gonna suck. And so it's like we're just gonna making the best of what we have right now because everything's all downhill from here. So I think that's a really interesting
Yeah.
analogy for what it's for like I don't know like college and high school and sort of like well
Mm,
we're in our 20s and this is as good as it's gonna get kind of thing.
I see. Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. Also just the way that the main guy like John what's
Oh
Godolkin,
yeah,
he
Godolphin, yes.
the way he kind of split everyone off into teams and like
Mhm.
they had like basically the culture that was made was like they had to hate each other. um
Right.
I found that really interesting, and it seemed like that he was kind of like obviously the G-Men and everything was based off of the X-Men and Godolkin was like the a spoof of Professor X. But I think
Right.
just his like, because at first he seems a little more like a more stern Professor X maybe, but as like the story
Right.
progresses, you learn he's like most of the soups in the boys, he's a monster. And just I feel like maybe splitting off the teams is kind of part of his manipulative like mind games that he plays
Mm,
on all the people. Like
right.
and he even like segregates like all the black people into two different groups. and
Right.
and it's
Right.
like a parody of like the East Side and West Side rappers. Like they even have like arguments over who killed that guy too cool instead of Tupac.
Mm,
It's
yeah.
pretty
Yeah.
interesting. And like well like how you were saying the G Wiz guys were upset because they were like the only G group that actually liked each other.
Yeah.
And then once they split off, they're like, well, we're gonna have to hate each other and after we
Right.
split off. But yeah, I found all that very interesting. I feel like it took me a couple issues to really get into the story. I
Mhm.
think partially because of how different the comic is from the show.
Right.
Like I have read the first volume, but it's been a couple years, and
Yeah.
like there's a very different tone.
Yes.
Definitely, I feel like the show feels more, even though it's like fantastical and crazy, feels a little more grounded in
Okay.
reality. Maybe feels more like the real world with superheroes. Like like it feels like that's what the in a lot of ways it feels kind of like what superheroes would look like in the real world.
Yeah.
Whereas the comic feels like much more of like a fantastical world of its own. I feel like
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
doesn't feel as like real, I guess. So like that, it takes a second to kind of get into that world, at least for me. But by
Yeah.
the
I
end of this,
also think.
yeah,
Oh, well, I was just going to comment on the differences between the show again,
yeah,
because I think that while they're both very like explicit, I guess, very
mm-hmm,
violent and sexual, I think that the show is almost more nuanced, for lack of a better term,
yeah,
because like I mean, right out the gate, I've read the first volume as well.
mm-hmm.
Right out the gate, like Butcher is like very clearly not a very good person. He's not meant to
Yeah,
be like
no,
relatable in any way at all. But the way the show depicts the boys and Butcher is like, yeah, he's evil, but there's definitely some humanity to it as well.
yeah, and I think that's what the way it is with a lot of characters in the show. They're a lot more
Yeah, yeah,
fleshed out, whereas in the comic, the only characters that really feel that like three dimensional are like Huey and
hmm,
Starlight and maybe Mother's Milk.
right,
At least from what I've read.
hmm,
But like all the seven don't really feel much nuance. They're just kind of the worst.
right,
There's no and just stuff like that. So I think the show does definitely excel in that respect with the characters. But yeah, I thought by the end it was a really interesting story, and it had multi
yeah,
layers, and just the whole thing where they were like they didn't reveal at first why all the G-men were messed up the way they were, and just kind
hmm,
of so sexual, like they were so sexually deviant that Huey was like, this like something happened to them, like this isn't normal, like they have
right,
no boundaries in their head of what's acceptable.
hmm, yeah,
And just the fact that like they kind of slowly revealed it over time. And also just the way like it was a bit of a mystery with
hmm,
Silver killing herself and then Mother's Milk kind of unraveling where the G-men come from. Like, are they really orphans? And it turns out they're not. And it's like this creepy, like, yeah, just this weird superhero, like, sex cult in a way. It's really
yeah,
weird. Yeah, so that was definitely interesting and well done the way they kind of slowly reveal that information until at the end you kind of get
yeah.
the big picture.
Hmm, hmm. I
But
also really like how they sort of, because the way it's presented in the comic, like the G-Men were kind of their own thing, and then like Vought sort of like
yeah,
bought them out, but then they don't really answer to anybody. So like
yeah.
Godolphin can kind of just do whatever he wants, but because they make so much money anyway, it's like they're not really gonna Vought's not really gonna do anything about it.
Until they do.
Right.
As-
Yeah, exactly.
right, because like the whole comic, like you're not really sure what's going down, but like the whole comic, Stillwell,
Yeah.
was I think talking to the president. I think that's who it was.
Mm,
and basically saying like we need to do something about Godolkin. He's like a wild card and he's crazy. And
yeah.
by the end, he's just like, yeah, we need to set our plan into motion, and they do. They just send like a kill squad out to kill them,
Yeah.
and they're just gonna like replace them and reboot them with like VOT sponsored
Right.
heroes. Seems like, but pretending like they're the G-men.
Yeah, I think that that's really funny because like it seems like there's going to be this battle between the boys and the G-men, but then the bot just shows up and they just kill everybody.
Yeah, and I was kind of wondering because like, what can the boys do? Because they didn't. I don't think they. Yeah, they didn't really use their pills or serum or whatever they have to make them
Yeah.
stronger. I'm not sure what they
Mm,
call it in the comics and in the show was called Temp V.
yeah.
But they didn't use that at all. So I was like, how are they gonna fight these guys?
Mm,
Yeah. Oh, and
right.
I thought that like Wolverine parody was kind of funny. That dude with just like hammers on
Mhm.
his hands,
Yeah.
and all he said was gonna. Like what the? That was pretty funny.
Right.
Oh,
Right.
I thought it was really interesting too how like the G-men's basically their only purpose was to keep people silent about all the messed up stuff that
Mm,
was happening. Like all
right.
the only people they fought were Soups. It seems like mostly former, if not all former G-men, or
Yeah.
members of the G, various squads that kind of got disillusioned and were going to like flap their gums or whatever, and
Right.
the G-men were sent to kill them. Basically, that seems like kind of how it, because that's what happened to I think Black Nubia or whatever her name was,
Yeah.
Nubia.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, she was gonna talk, then Silver killed her, and then Vought had some resurrection thing. Which do you know what that is? The resurrection thing they were talking about. I'm not really
I
because
think that in the comics,
mm-hmm.
the what's the name of the drug? I'm spacing on it. Compound V, that's
Kakama
what it
V,
is.
yeah.
I think that in the comics it's just so powerful that even after the the soups die, like
Oh,
they
okay.
still it still is enough to like sustain their corpse, even though there's not really any like
Mm-hmm.
even though their brains and I guess their souls too. I don't know if what whatever. I'm not going to open that can
Sure,
of
sure,
worms,
yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
like their intellect is not there anymore, but they're
Yeah.
still able to like function at like a base level.
Yeah, which we saw with Nubia. She was just
Right.
kind of like she can only say that like all she could say was like "help me" or something. And she like
Yeah. Yeah.
said it to Huey, and I thought that scene was funny too. Just how much
Mhm.
Huey freaked out. He was just like screaming. Uh,
Right.
that was pretty
Right.
funny. So have you seen Gen V at all yet?
No, I haven't. I haven't. We don't have any Wi-Fi, and we're
Oh,
setting up
right.
for a shoot, so I'll probably like watch it in like a week or two when all that winds up. But yeah, I've been
Sure.
really busy, so I haven't seen it yet.
Sure. Yeah, so it's literally nothing like the comic at all. I watched the first three episodes when they came out, like the day after they came out, and
Mm.
then we read this, and I was like, "There's literally nothing." The only thing
Right.
that so I mean I get it because like the series the spin-off Gen V feels totally in line with this show. Like it totally fits into the world
Mm.
perfectly. And even
Okay.
though it's not really a retcon because they haven't explored the universe that much. They have a little
Mhm.
bit, but just like, the fact this university's been training soups for forever, like it feels like it fits perfect and it doesn't feel, like shoehorned in at all. It feels
Yeah.
authentic. And
Mhm.
they're more going for what it feels like what actual college campuses are like nowadays, and it's more
Yeah.
like a you know college genre
Mhm.
type thing. I don't know what to call it, but um so they nail that really well, and like the book wasn't really anything like that besides like their frat house they lived in, G was lived in.
Right.
But like all the characters, I don't know if they're original, but they are not from this storyline.
Okay.
Um, and the only really thing that's similar to this storyline at all is they took the name of the guy John Godolkin. I think he's
Okay.
kind of a character, but he's dead. But he founded the school, so it's called
Um.
Godolkin University.
Okay.
And that's pretty much it. Everything else is completely different so far, but
Mm,
it still fits in with like the boys' world, like even from the
okay.
comics, because there's characters like I think they mention Tech Knight, and Tech Knight actually shows up in the fourth episode. Um,
Okay.
and he's mentioned like all the time in the boys' comics, and I think he was
Yeah.
even mentioned briefly, like offhandedly, in this story arc at some
Yeah.
point. But yeah,
Mhm.
but other than that, it's like nothing like the comic at all. I was kind of surprised because when I
Mhm.
looked it up, I was like, oh, it's based off of this story arc from the boys, and it's like, well, not really. No, it's kind of like they just had like, what if we set a boys spinoff in college with young Soups and having to deal with
Mm,
all of the politics and facade and everything of the Soups, as
right.
18-year-olds is trying to establish themselves as heroes. But it feels like maybe they like we're like, oh well, there's kind of a college group in the comics, and they just like looked at it and they're like, yeah, sure, let's base it off of that, kind of, maybe not really.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that
It
being
seems
said, it
like
is
that
really
they
good.
kind of yeah. Seems like they kind of take like the general idea
Yeah.
of the G Wiz and they kind of take it in a different direction.
Yeah.
Again, I haven't seen this film, but that's kind of what it seems like.
Well, they do that a lot in the boys too, because like,
Yeah.
so Soldier Boy's character was very
Mm,
different than he was in the
right.
comics. Things like that. Like they definitely, I feel like it's definitely very loosely inspired. Probably
Right.
more so than most like Marvel and DC properties in like
Yeah. Yeah.
movies and shows. Like even when they stray from the comics, they're still, I think, a little closer than the boys stick. But
Mhm.
I think in this case, I think to translate it to a show, they would kind of need to make a lot of changes. So I definitely don't think it's a bad
Right.
thing.
Yeah. Yeah. As long as it's good, it doesn't really
Hmm.
matter.
But that being said, definitely check out Gen V if you get the chance.
Yeah.
And if you're into comics, definitely check out some of the boys' comics.
Hmm. Hmm.
They're definitely pretty good. I will say, I think the comics are more shocking. Like they had they feel like they're trying to be more shocking than the show, even though
Yes.
the show definitely does. The comics are just like way more like that.
Yeah. It's very edgy and mean
Yeah,
and like
yeah.
you mentioned, it's not accessible as a TV show.
Well, yeah. There's even a scene where like all the guys in G Wiz are like jerking each other off and stuff. You're just
Right.
like, what the hell? What the hell am I
Yeah.
watching
Exactly.
or looking at? Like even when
Yeah.
when I was reading it and I turned the page, I was like, what? Like what the hell? I was not
Yeah.
expecting
Yeah.
that.
For sure.
But yeah. Do you have a cultured pick for this week?
Yeah, I picked it this week. I picked big game number 3,
Oh,
and it
nice.
is yeah, this one seems like issue 2 seemed to stick more with Hit Girl, but this one seems to just kind of be a montage of all the different characters as like because I mean there's I think there's only 5 issues, maybe 6, but as we're
Okay,
gearing towards the end of the series, it's sort of like kind of a montage of where everybody is, and then we're kind of moving towards the finish line, I guess. But it's
gotcha.
it's still good. I'm a big fan of Mark Miller, and so
Yeah,
it's still a really good issue.
yeah. How many issues are in this series?
I think it's 5 or 6. I'm not
Okay,
sure.
okay. Gotcha, gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've read the first issue, but I haven't read the other two yet.
Hmm.
What I thought was really cool with the first issue was when they went to Kick Ass. Like they basically were like, yeah, it's been like a long time. Like he's been a
Yeah.
superhero for a long time. So it was interesting seeing him like more as an adult now with like I think he even had like a family.
Yeah, I think that on Twitter, Mark Miller said that it's basically been real time. So he's like in his 30s now,
Okay, yeah.
and yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah, I found that pretty interesting kind of seeing
mhm,
an older Kick Ass. Even though we didn't really get to
yeah,
see much, at least in the first issue. I don't know if he appears more in the later issues, but
yeah, yeah, yeah.
um,
It's a really good series, and I'm excited to see where it goes.
yeah, yeah, and it kind of makes me want to read the other comics like Nemesis
Yeah,
and Kingsman and stuff.
right, right.
But my cultured pick this week is Ghost Rider Wolverine, Acts of
Uh,
Vengeance, Alpha. There's like an Alpha and an Omega, and then like two other comics
mm,
in between. It's like this 4 issue comic crossover. So that this is the first one, and it's pretty interesting. Like, I think Ghost Rider and Wolverine have like crossed over like a long time ago. I think once in the comics. But this is a really interesting crossover because it does a kind of a flashback slash retcon where
mhm.
um there's like this demon that has kind of like latched itself to this young boy. And like this like his caretaker takes the boy to Professor X, because she thinks he's a mutant, and Professor X like tries to reread his mind, but he's like, no, get the hell out of here, that kid's crazy, you know. And so Wolverine and Ghost Rider kind of end up both going after this kid because like as he becomes an adult, he becomes an even bigger threat. And what's
Mhm.
what's really cool is as the series goes on, the demon ends up leaving this boy who's now an adult and ends up like possessing Wolverine, and
Ah,
they call him Helverine. It's kind of funny, but there's like a pretty good like there's just kind of like a cool standoff between Ghost Rider and basically Ghost Rider Wolverine, and it's just kind of
mm,
a fun little crossover. It's only 4 issues, but
yeah.
it's kind of cool, and I kind of feel like they work together, even though they don't have much in common. Ghost Rider
Mhm.
and Wolverine, I feel like kind of fit together because they're kind of on the more like violent and
Yeah, for sure.
gruff kind of side of Marvel.
Mhm.
But yeah, that being said, that is it for this episode. If you want to enter the giveaway, like I
Mhm.
said earlier, be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and comment your answer to this week's question in the comments. And yeah, a
Yeah.
winner is going to be picked by the end of this month, at the end of this month. So yeah, all that said,
Yeah.
we'll see you next time. This has been TCN Presents The Cultured Pull List. If you would like to support us on Patreon to help us bring you more content, check us out at patreon.com/theculturednerd and look for our show specific tier if you would like to support our show specifically. I have been your host, Michael Malillo. My co-host has been Luke S. Our logo was designed by Jose Navarro, and our intro was designed by me. Thank you so much for joining us. Please like and subscribe, that really helps a lot. Scan the QR code on the bottom left to check out The Cultured Nerd on social media. And scan the QR code on the bottom right to check out me and Luke's other brand, Casual Experts, on social media, YouTube, and our other podcast. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.